Hey everyone, it is time to review Anima, Gate of Memories 1 and 2 remasters. So as usual, let's talk about the story, gameplay, graphics and music. This is one of those series that has been around for a while, but almost no one remembers. In my case, I'm new to the series, I saw this thing, used the classic technique I have shown a couple of times, and into the backlog. Now, as far as I know, the first game was funded in Kickstarter back in 2012. And seems like in 2027 the continuation of the story is going to be released, but I'll leave some of these comments for the graphics section. Without further ado, let's begin. Anima Gate of Memories takes place in a world engulfed in war, where a witch known as Red Lady took an important book from the Order of Nathaniel. Then this order sent the Bearer, a nameless girl who is capable of using a forbidden power, aka Ergo Mundus. Soon enough they find the Red Lady, but of course she wasn't going to surrender that easily, as she has a specific objective in mind. Little after, and in another story, she is also pulling the strings, while the Inquisitors fight the Nameless. It is worth mentioning that these two games follow the same story, just taking place in different areas, on one side with the Bearer of Calamities, while on the other we find the Nameless. And for better or worse, both protagonists fall into the trap set by Red Lady, where they are sent into a mysterious tower, where they will find another eccentric people inside, as well as who they are. Now, what can I say in general? For better or worse, this story is rather polarizing to me, because the concept and ideas are quite interesting, but some moments along the journey can be The idea is that they have to collect memories left and right, about different characters. Both protagonists have a similar objective, and of course, they are helped by different people. Up to that point, it is all cool, because some of these side stories are quite interesting. Where it doesn't go that well, or it feels a bit tedious, is regarding the kinds of conversations that the Bearer and Ergo will have. Mostly because the writing is like Ergo wants to be edgy with this girl. If it were in a couple of conversations, I wouldn't really mind, but they turn quite repetitive. Sure, I get it is important to set character and things like that, but rather than diving a bit more into the lore of the game or other details like that, some ideas start to go in circles, which is a missed opportunity, because then again, the lore and side stories are quite cool. Yes, some of them are walls of text, but I was having much more fun reading or listening to those stories rather than watching this duo. In any case, that only happens on this side of the journey, because the Nameless has a better narrative. Sure, you end up looking at some similar scenes or chronicles, at least while following the first messengers, but aside from that, there are multiple little twists that are much more enjoyable. I would give the stories a 7 and an 8. What makes the first game reach the decent side is the lore and what is going on in general. Most of the journey is filled with cool ideas, of course, if you're willing to put up with what our edgy fella has to say. While on the other side, the Nameless gets to close some loose ends, plus sharing where this whole mess might point to. And a nice detail is that these games are pretty much fully voice acted. Gameplay-wise, Anima Gate of Memories 1 and 2 are action RPGs, with a small dash of Metroidvania, at least considering that it is not a linear adventure. You can go here or there if you desire. However, before getting into specifics, let's talk about the difficulty. While beginning the game there are 4 difficulties, where I chose normal. And sure, along the way I died multiple times, but most of those failures were kinda expected. Nonetheless, some bosses have a gimmick or two as you reduce their HP bar, where depending from the encounter, they may change their patterns 2 or 3 times. Up to that point it is all good, but among those bosses, you might find a really stressful fight. So in general I will say that, for the most part, it is a 5 chipotles out of 10, and that specific fight a 7 habaneros out of 10. There are ways to tackle the challenge, but it is simply unfair unless you leave it up until the very end, and after doing a specific series of quests. Now, what is cool is that you don't have to follow a particular sequence along the levels. Sure, you cannot go everywhere, but at the end of the day, you can decide if you want to finish a specific place first or something along those lines. But that may be the list of issues. Something much more important to mention is that this game feels like a PS2 RPG, in the good sense, but keep in mind that The pace was different around those times, and that is the general feeling I had while playing both sides of the story. In any case, something I love so much is that there are puzzles everywhere. Sometimes they are kinda tricky, having to check notes, specific parts of the messenger's stories, or simply try logical sequences. Plus some platforming in few cases. But don't worry that much, if you have some experience in these kinds of third-person games, it isn't that big of a deal. However, it is fair to mention this point, because depending how clever you are, you will be running up and down trying to understand how some puzzles work. As you proceed, you will find weapons and some accessories that you can change depending from the kind of build you want to make. For example, something kinda weak but able to farm experience, have something balanced between magic and physical, or specialize your character for one thing while the other is good with something else. And each level will give you a couple of points to allocate them within different skills, also being able to specialize each member as you advance, so you can choose passive skills or get something better out of known skills. Considering all of those details, I will give them a 7.5 in their gameplays. They are rather entertaining, but for the most part they are as most traditional action RPGs. The side I loved so much, and something that made me change gears, were the puzzles. Cracking my head in some cases was quite amazing, and I believe that is something worth praising, unlike some other RPGs that sell you more of the same but without adding something interesting. In the graphics section, I check glitches, aesthetics, performance, and other visual ideas. What is worth mentioning is that there are minor glitches. Now, for example, there are some enemies that sometimes do not spawn in the right places, being stuck inside rocks or something along those lines. Or in two specific cases with a peculiar enemy being completely invisible. Ironically, you have to beat it to keep advancing, but yeah, it is invisible for some reason. However, those are minor details. There is one boss fight that I won't show here, but the deal is that frames drop like mad, and you might get hit out of nowhere. That is probably the most stressful thing because the fight is a bit tight with hits, cures and things like that, at least considering that you have two enemies at the same time, and unfortunately it is a persistent problem. And it happens every single time you have those two enemies in the field. During the fight, a bit annoying. Aside from those hiccups, everything else was good. Now, this is a quite gorgeous game. The very first area is not so much, but once you get to see what's inside the tower, oof, I fell in love with these dreamlike environments. In plenty of rooms you have me taking some minutes to look around and enjoy the scenery, those weird and catchy ideas. Don't worry, I won't show every place, but plenty of them were simply beautiful. And while they are kinda counted, for the most part they were really good. That is the cool side. But it is important to remember that this is pretty much an indie game, so there are some compromises left and right. For example, character animations. In general they are non-existent, and I gotta say, it threw me off guard while looking at the first scenes, like, is it me or did they put the 3D models just like that? Later you get used to these scenes, but yeah, most likely that was going to be a headache to deal with, so leaving them like that is understandable, especially for 3D environments. Some other scenes were presented as visual novels, having the 3D characters move around while talking about the XYZ thing, and other parts are presented as something like basic drawings while sharing a narrative. At least let's recognize that there were multiple ideas to make the journey as enjoyable as possible, rather than sticking with only one execution. Where it doesn't go that well, at least to me, is considering the kinds of enemies you are going to fight. For better or worse, some of them were into the, oh well, there are enemies, but they are rather ugly, as well as some textures in peculiar places. Now, talking about the future release. It is worth mentioning that it looks quite different, at least in contrast to this game, but considering they are the same group, I would guess that polishing all the environments to reach something like this game took quite the time, considering that the remaster focused mainly on that. Putting both the games side by side, it looks kinda off, but who knows what is going to happen in the future. Considering these details, I will give them an 8 in the graphics. Then again, mainly because I fell in love with some environments. And last but not least, the music. There are like 25-30 tracks in the game, going for around 1 hour and 30 minutes, where the main idea will fall into ambience tracks, with a spice of electronic and orchestral executions. Most of the OST was written by Damian Sanchez, who has worked on games like Temtem, Rise and Shine, Blues and Bullets, among others. Now, similarly as in the graphics section, the OST is quite amazing. I love it because of the melodious vibes they have. For example, in Lands of Folklore, the rhythm is quite chill, but without falling into another boring pan flute execution. On the contrary, the track is balanced marvelously between strings, air instruments, and percussions. In these peculiar cases, I end up listening to the soundtrack numerous times before getting into the game, and since I was listening to it, it hooked me into several melodies: Ryland, Arcane, Derelict Temple, The Season Temple, Graven, among others. The match between environment and OST is simply gorgeous, at least considering the main topic of the game, and that you're not fighting monsters in every corner. And for better or worse, these ambience tracks can be a double-edged sword, at least if you don't enjoy doing puzzles while listening to something chill. Worst case scenario, you will end up falling asleep, but at least in my case it was a really good experience, and an OST that will go into my pile of things to listen to from time to time. I would give them a 9. Considering they have the same soundtrack, it would have been cool to hear something different in the Nameless route, but who knows what happened while these games were developed. Anima, Gate of Memories 1 and 2 Remaster get a 7.8 and 8.1. While the execution is quite peculiar, taking things from some years ago, the truth is that they are quite enjoyable, considering that these games were developed by a small group. And to be honest, I will only recommend them for those who enjoy precisely those old school executions plus gimmicks in between. If you're looking for something filled with pure action, then you better look into another direction. With this, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.